all of recorded human history, no nation that was destroyed and scattered ever came back. Not once. The Babylonians are gone. The Assyrians are gone. The Phoenicians, who taught the world to write, are gone. The Carthaginians, who nearly broke Rome, are gone. When a civilization loses its land, its temple, and its political power simultaneously, history has a name for what comes next: extinction. There is one exception. A people who lost their land in 70 AD were expelled from it again in 135 AD, and then spent the next 1800 years scattered across every continent on Earth, surrounded by cultures specifically designed to absorb them. They lived under Christian empires, Islamic caliphates, and secular republics. They were converted by force, expelled by decree, and systematically murdered at industrial scale. Every condition that erases a people was present. Every historical precedent said they would dissolve. They didn't dissolve. In 1948, they rebuilt. No archaeologist, no historian, no anthropologist has ever produced a satisfactory explanation for how that is possible, because by every measurable standard of how civilizations survive or disappear, it should not have happened. This is not a documentary about the conflict you see on the news. This is about something far older and far stranger. This is the story of the single most statistically improbable act of civilizational survival in recorded human history. And the mechanism behind it, once you understand it, will change how you see not just Israel, but every question of identity, culture, and survival in the modern world. The question is not whether you support Israel or oppose it. The question is, how did this happen at all? In the year 70 AD, the most powerful military force on earth came to finish a job. The Roman general Titus surrounded Jerusalem with 4 legions, 60,000 trained soldiers. The siege lasted 5 months. By the end of it, the city was unrecognizable. The temple, the physical and spiritual center of Jewish civilization, was gone, burned to its foundations. 1.1 million people died. The streets ran with blood. The survivors were marched to Rome in chains to be paraded through the city as proof of what happens to people who resist the empire. Roman soldiers carried the temple's sacred menorah through the streets of Rome. That moment was considered so complete that the Romans carved it into stone. The Arch of Titus still stands in the Roman Forum today. Rome had done this before. They were good at it. When Carthage resisted them, they burned it and erased it so completely that today we know almost nothing about what Carthaginian culture actually felt like from the inside. When they broke a people, that people stayed broken. What happened next in Jerusalem should therefore have been straightforward. A people without a temple, without a city, without political authority, scattered across an empire that had just demonstrated its willingness to destroy them completely, should have dissolved. That is what history said would happen. But before the temple fell, one man made one decision. His name was Yochanan ben Zakkai. He was a rabbi, a scholar. As the Roman siege tightened and Jerusalem began to starve, ben Zakkai understood something that almost no one around him could bring themselves to accept. The temple was going to fall, so he did something extraordinary. Ben Zakkai had himself smuggled out of Jerusalem in a coffin. His students carried him past the Roman lines, past the soldiers, out of the dying city. He was brought before the Roman general Vespasian, and there, in front of the man whose army was in the process of destroying his world, he made a request. He asked for a small coastal town called Yavne, and he asked for permission to open a school there. Vespasian agreed. That school became the most consequential educational institution in history. At Yavne, Ben Zakkai and his scholars systematically transferred an entire civilization's identity from a physical location into a portable text. The result was the Mishnah, the foundational layer of what would become the Talmud, a document so comprehensive and so precisely constructed that a Jewish community anywhere on earth, in any century, could open it and know exactly who they were, what they believed, and how to live. 65 years after Titus burned the temple, the Emperor Hadrian tried to finish what Titus had started. The Bar Kokhba revolt ended in another catastrophic Roman victory. This time, Hadrian banned Jews from Jerusalem entirely, renamed the city Aelia Capitolina and erected a temple to Jupiter on the site of the destroyed Jewish temple. He was attempting to erase not just the people, but the memory of the people. It did not work, because the mechanism Ben Zakkai had built at Yavne was already running. Communities spread across the Roman Empire, Persia, North Africa, and beyond were already sustaining themselves through the text, the calendar, and the law. Over the next 2 centuries, Roman policy toward Jewish communities shifted repeatedly between tolerance and persecution. It did not matter. The survival mechanism did not depend on Roman policy. It depended on a school that a general had dismissed as harmless because he did not understand what a school could do. Titus won the battle. Vespasian won the siege. Yochanan ben Zakkai won the next 2,000 years. But survival required more than a portable legal system. It required something even more fundamental: a language. And what happened to that language over the next 18 centuries is something that should not have been possible, because by the 19th century, the language of that text was spoken as a daily living tongue by virtually nobody on earth. It existed in prayer and in scholarship, not in the street, not in the home, not between a mother and her child. One man decided to change that, and what he did next has never been replicated by any linguist, any government, or any cultural movement in recorded history. In the 1870s, across the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, something was already broken that most people had stopped noticing. The Hebrew language was dying. It had been dying slowly for nearly 17 centuries. Jewish communities in Poland spoke Yiddish. Communities in Morocco spoke Judeo-Arabic. Communities in Spain and across the Ottoman Empire spoke Ladino. In Persia, it was Judeo-Persian. Hebrew existed. It sat at the center of every community's religious life. Every Sabbath, every prayer, every annual cycle of Torah readings happened in Hebrew. But when the service ended, nobody continued the conversation in Hebrew. Then a young man from Belarus decided the linguists were wrong. His name was Eliezer ben Yehuda. He was a young Jewish intellectual who had grown up watching his community exist in a permanent state of in-between. He read, he thought, and he arrived at a conclusion: a people without a shared spoken language could not become a unified nation, and the only language that belonged equally to every Jewish community on earth was Hebrew. In 1881, he arrived in Palestine, and on the boat crossing the Mediterranean, he made a decision. From this moment forward, he would speak only Hebrew, so he immediately began looking for a Hebrew-speaking wife. He found Deborah Jonas, wrote to her in Hebrew, and informed her that their home would be the first Hebrew-speaking household in 17 centuries. Their son, Ben Zion ben Yehuda, was born in 1882. Devorah spoke only Hebrew to him from the moment of his birth, but a single household speaking Hebrew didn't make a language. Ben Yehuda understood that revival required infrastructure, newspapers, schools. He compiled a dictionary of the Hebrew language, a project so vast he didn't live to finish it. After he died in 1922, his family completed the dictionary. He founded Hebrew language newspapers, lobbied relentlessly for Hebrew to be used in Jewish schools, and argued publicly with every faction of the Jewish community who considered his project either unnecessary or impossible. The ultra-Orthodox community largely opposed him. European Jewish intellectuals considered Yiddish the natural language of Jewish culture. But Ben Yehuda was having none of it. By the time Israel declared independence in 1948, Hebrew was the daily spoken language of a functioning modern society. A language that had been liturgical and scholarly for 17 centuries had become, within a single human lifetime, the mother tongue of a nation. No government program achieved this. No international body funded it. What Ben Yehuda achieved had never happened before in recorded human history and has not happened since. But rebuilding a language required people to be in the same place, and getting the scattered communities of the world to that single place required an idea so radical that even most Jewish communities initially rejected it outright. The man who proposed it was a secular Viennese journalist with no political power, no land, and no army. He died without seeing a single part of his plans succeed. But 44 years after his death, a nation declared independence in his name. In the spring of 1894, a young Viennese journalist sat in a Paris courtroom watching something that would change the course of history. His name was Theodor Herzl. He wrote for the Neue Freie Presse, one of the most prestigious newspapers in Europe. He wore European clothes, moved in intellectual circles, and had spent most of his adult life operating on the assumption that educated Jews in modern Europe had solved the problem of being Jewish by becoming fully European. He was watching the public degradation of Alfred Dreyfus, a French army officer accused of passing military secrets to Germany. The evidence against him was fabricated. The real motivation was straightforward. Dreyfus was Jewish. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was chanting. Herzl stood in that crowd and arrived at a conclusion he would spend the rest of his life trying to make the world accept. It didn't matter how assimilated a Jewish community became, how educated or how deeply integrated into European society. The conditions for persecution would always exist as long as Jewish people remained a minority without a state of their own. He went home and he wrote. For weeks he barely slept. What emerged was not a manifesto or a political speech. It was something far more unusual, a precise, practical blueprint for the creation of a Jewish state. He called it Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, published in 1896. The response was immediate and hostile. The established Jewish community leadership in Western Europe considered him an embarrassment. The Rothschilds refused to meet him. The chief rabbi of Vienna dismissed the pamphlet as dangerous fantasy. The Yiddish-speaking communities of Eastern Europe were suspicious of this Viennese intellectual who had spent his life largely indifferent to their existence until a French courtroom changed his mind. He pushed forward regardless. Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel. For 3 days they debated and ultimately agreed on a single platform: the establishment of a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured by public law. Herzl wrote in his diary that night, "In Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I were to say this today, I would be greeted by laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50, everyone will know it." He went to the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who controlled Palestine, and proposed a deal. The Sultan received him twice and rejected him both times. Palestine was not for sale. He sought an audience with Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. He listened, expressed interest, and then did nothing. The Kaiser moved on. The British offered an alternative, a territory in Uganda, a place where Jewish refugees from Russian persecution could settle without the political complications of Palestine. Herzl brought the Uganda proposal to the 6th Zionist Congress in 1903. It nearly tore the movement apart. It was Palestine or nothing. The land had a specific name and meaning, and no administrative pragmatism could replace it. He never recovered from the stress of the Uganda crisis. Theodor Herzl died on the 3rd of July, 1904, exhausted, and with nothing he had proposed yet built. He left behind an organization, a published blueprint, and a generation of people who had decided he was right. The work continued without him. Hebrew schools multiplied across Eastern Europe. Zionist federations organized in dozens of countries. Jewish immigration to Palestine accelerated. The land he had never seen began slowly and quietly, filling with people who had read his pamphlet and taken it seriously. 44 years after Herzl's death, David Ben-Gurion stood at a podium in Tel Aviv and read the Declaration of the State of Israel. Behind him on the wall hung a single portrait, Theodor Herzl. He died before he saw a single brick was laid. But the city that grew from his blueprint now stretches along the Mediterranean coast in every direction. But within 24 hours of Ben-Gurion reading the declaration, 5 armies crossed the border. What happened in the next 12 months is one of the most studied and least understood military episodes of the 20th century. After David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel, the room applauded. People wept. By dawn the following morning, armies were moving in. Egypt from the south, Jordan from the east, Syria and Lebanon from the north, and Iraq from the northeast. What was coming would be a war of extermination. Israel had no military. It relied on the Haganah, the pre-state Jewish paramilitary organization of roughly 35,000 fighters. Their weapons were a mixture of purchased, smuggled, and homemade. Their armored vehicles were civilian trucks with steel plates welded to the sides. Egypt fielded a professional army with artillery, armored vehicles, and aircraft. The Jordanian Arab Legion, trained by British commanders, was considered the most well-equipped military force in the entire region. Syria and Iraq both fielded conventional armies with tanks and heavy weapons. Israel should have ceased to exist within weeks. Stalin calculated that a Jewish state might become a socialist ally in the Middle East. He instructed the Czech government to sell arms to Israel. Rifles, machine guns, artillery pieces were loaded to cargo planes in Czechoslovakia and flown to Israel through a series of clandestine flights. The Messerschmitt fighters that Israel's pilots flew into combat were Czech-built. The rifles carried by Israeli infantry were Czech-supplied. The arms pipeline from behind the Iron Curtain was the single most important factor in Israel's survival in the first weeks of the war. Jerusalem was the war's most brutal theater. The road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem ran through the Judean hills and was controlled by Arab forces who cut the city's supply lines completely. The Jewish population of Jerusalem faced starvation. Israel launched a series of operations to break the siege of Jerusalem that resulted in some of the heaviest casualties of the entire war. The ceasefire periods brokered by the United Nations were the decisive factor that most military histories understate. The Arab coalition pressured for ceasefires when their armies were advancing. Jewish veterans of the Second World War, men who had fought with the British Army, the American Army, the Canadian Army, and the Free French, were arriving in Israel throughout the war and bringing with them combat experience that Israel's forces desperately needed. By the second phase of the war, Israel was a meaningfully different military force. By October 1948, the war had shifted. Israel launched Operation Yoav in the south, breaking the Egyptian lines in the Negev desert. In the north, Operation Hiram cleared Arab forces from the Galilee. The army that had started the war as a collection of paramilitary units with improvised armored vehicles was now conducting coordinated multi-front offensive operations. The armistice agreements were signed in Rhodes between January and July 1949. Egypt signed first, then Jordan and Lebanon, then Syria. Iraq refused to sign and withdrew its forces. The war was over in the formal sense, but what the armistice produced was not peace. It produced ceasefire lines, the lines where the fighting happened to stop, and every conflict that followed for the next 7 decades grew directly from the questions those lines left unanswered. 6,000 Israelis died in the war. Many of the dead were recent arrivals, people who had survived the Holocaust and reached Palestine only to die in the war that followed. What the 1949 armistice left behind was a state that existed but was not recognized by any of its neighbors. A state that had won a war it should have lost, but had not yet won the peace that should have followed. The surrounding Arab states refused to accept its existence. Trade was blocked. Airspace was closed. The armistice was not a beginning. It was a pause. But into this unresolved geography, a second challenge was already arriving. Between 1948 and 1951, Israel's population doubled. Jews were coming from everywhere. Communities that hadn't been in contact with each other for thousands of years were arriving simultaneously and being asked to become a single people. What happened when they actually met is something the nation never prepared for, and the tensions it created nearly broke the country before any external enemy could.